I'd like to read another 3 verses from much earlier in the Holy Scriptures. Verses that, in my estimation, help us to make sense of this unusual, curious event in the life of Jesus. It's the end of the 3rd chapter of Genesis, when the man and the woman have rebelled against God's rule. He has banished them from his presence in the Garden of Eden, and he declares curses on each of the parties, the serpent and the woman and the man. And towards the end of that, in verses 14 and 15, he said these words, "The Lord God said to the serpent, 'Because you've done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel.'" As far as I can recall, and at my age recollection is not to be trusted, but as far as I can recall, I've never spoken to anyone about Mark 5 and the event of the demons and the pigs and the demoniacs. Never spoken to anyone or read anything about it or conversed with anyone about it who did not regard it as perhaps the oddest event in the life of Jesus. Everyone finds the passage at a minimum curious, and many find it downright disturbing. We don't really mind the man being delivered of his demons. We're all pleased about that. It's the 2,000 pigs being drowned in the sea with demons of them that disturbs us a little bit, right? Why would Jesus do such an apparently cruel and senseless and destructive thing to these pigs? Especially, we raise the question because on several other occasions, the Gospels candidly record the deliverance of demoniacs when no price had to be paid and no one had to be injured. In Matthew 8:16, that evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word. In Matthew 12:22, a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute was brought to him, and he healed him, so that the man spoke and saw. Matthew 15, behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire," and her daughter was healed immediately. Indeed, our present passage, where 2,000 pigs are destroyed in the deliverance of this man, is such a disturbing and peculiar narrative that an old friend of mine in college who was also pre-minister came to me one day in my dorm room. He said, "Dave, I am really troubled." I said, "Kenny, why? Are you having trouble with your classes?" No, he says, "I'm reading through Mark's Gospel now, and I've read this passage where Jesus destroys 2,000 pigs in the lake. My Jesus wouldn't do that." I don't really encourage people to have their own Jesus different from the one that we find in Holy Scriptures. But Kenny can at least be approved for his candor, right? For saying a thing that was, as Pope might have said, often thought but ne'er so well expressed. Right? Many others had had the same thought. Most of the people that I've spoken with are as troubled by this passage as my friend Kenny was. However, there is one person who visited this planet one time. A person I haven't met personally, and you haven't either. At least one person who did not raise an objection to this event. And that was the demoniac. That delivered man, once tormented as severely as he was, did not object to the curiosity of the destruction of 2,000 pigs, if necessary, to rescue him. As with other biblical passages, Jim was used to this at Gordon Conwell, and Ben is now used to it at Grove City College. As with other difficult passages, I normally say to people, well, hold on, take a deep breath. Calm down. And let's just work our way patiently through the passage and see if it won't explain itself on its own terms. And I suggest we do so again this morning, using the most simple of narrative devices, just evaluating the plot. Almost all plots in every language and in every culture have a setting. They have rising and falling action, and some kind of a denouement or conclusion that helps us understand the consequences of the story. And I would recommend that we look at those three parts together today to see if we may be at least a little less puzzled at the end than we were at the beginning. The setting is rather remarkable for us in the sense that in the first 5 verses, Mark goes out of his way to indicate that this poor man was utterly enslaved by evil and death. He could have said so in a single sentence, but he actually says 4 very specific things to make the point. First, he indicates that he was a danger to himself. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and bruising himself with stones. Second, the text makes it clear that he was a virtual exile from society. Let yourself feel the weight of that. Most of us, when we are suffering in some way, at least find consolation when other humans who bear God's image share our sorrow with us. And they console us, right? I was in prison and you came to me. I was sick and you visited me, right? But he's all alone. The text says night and day among the tombs and on the mountains. He was crying out. He wasn't living in the presence of ordinary human beings. He was out on the hillsides. You may enjoy your mountains here, and we plan to enjoy them later in the week ourselves. But in the ancient world where you needed fresh amounts of water, people didn't live up on the mountains. They didn't have enough water to survive. It's a way of saying he was all alone. Not only was he alone and bereft of human society, in the third place the text tells us he was surrounded by death. Verse 3 says he lived among the tombs. And verse 5 reiterates by saying night and day among the tombs and on the mountains. He was always crying out. So you feel the weight of that. His current earthly life is miserable. And then all around him, he sees not a ray of hope, but reminders of death. He has no hope in this life. He afflicts himself with pain. No humans are present to console or comfort him in any way. And then on top of it all, he sees tombs reminding him of his eventual mortality. And then finally, you'll note also in the fourth place, the setting tells us that his great misery was irremediable by human effort. No one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. No one had the strength to subdue him. There was no specialist to whom he would be taken in the region. No one, the text says to us. No one. So it's an utterly hopeless condition of sorrow, pain, loneliness, and the expectation only of death. And then in the rising and falling action, verses 6 through 13, Jesus, as is typical of his miracles in the fourth gospel, delivers the demoniac somewhat quickly. The text, however, has 2 parts, not one. The first part, of course, is we know that the demoniac, oddly enough, did not ask for Jesus' help, but asked him to go away. Right? Crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." Now, in the other story we were reminded of earlier, the Canaanite woman came and solicited Jesus' help for his daughter. But this individual actually says, "Leave me alone and go away." Or at least the demon speaking. Nonetheless, and then this second part we just find very curious. Jesus sent the demons into the herd of pigs. A great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. The unclean spirits came out and into the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. Some of you have listened to the Bible on audio tape. And if you've listened to 2 or 3 different versions, you note that many of them are very straightforward and just a speaker with a clean voice articulating the words of Holy Scripture. Others have some background sound, a little quiet music perhaps, a nice flautist or something. Well, the flute wouldn't do for this one. Right? What kind of a soundtrack do you put for 2,000 pigs screaming down the hillside into a lake? I understand from people who've been in the region that the hill sloped off sort of gradually, and at some point it is so steep that if you step beyond it, you can't reverse track and go back up the hill. So at some point the herd realizes, as it gathers its momentum, that it is screaming down the hillside into a lake to be drowned. I don't think I've ever seen 2,000 pigs at one point, right? I've been to a few faculty meetings, 30 or 40 of them. But as a child in Virginia, several of my uncles had a few pigs, and even 2 or 3 of them, if you startled them or disturbed them, could make quite a racket. I can only imagine what 2,000 of them heading towards death sounded like. But if you're listening to it on audio tape, I recommend pulling the headphones off at that point, just in case, because it could be rowdy. And then the denouement consists of 2 parts there in verses 14 through 20, and notice that it is a lengthy denouement that does take 6 or 7 verses. As though Mark says, the story is not self-explanatory. What happens afterwards is needed to pull the loose ends together and make some sense of it. And so in the first part, in verses 14 through 17, there is this cameo appearance by the herdsman, whose livelihood we might suggest has recently been threatened, right? They also wanted nothing to do with Jesus for a variety of reasons, economic and otherwise, I suppose. The text says candidly they were afraid. They came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind, and they were joyous, they were grateful, they were afraid. Text doesn't even tell us why. Maybe they were unscrupulous businessmen. If he did this to 2,000 pigs, what would he do to 5 unscrupulous businessmen? But they were afraid. And then the text says they fled from Jesus. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country. There are a number of words for traveling, for walking and running and these kinds of things. Ben could list them for you. He's a good Greek student. His father wasn't so good, so he couldn't. But as Ben would explain, given the opportunity, the term for fleeing here is ordinarily used in the New Testament for fleeing a life-threatening circumstance. So it doesn't just mean they exited the church after the sermon mercifully finally ended. Right? It is used, for instance, during the slaughter of the innocents recorded at the birth of Jesus, when the angel of the Lord had to warn Joseph and Mary about Herod's plot to kill all the innocent infants. And the angel said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." It's the same verb for flee in the original as it is in our passage. It's also used when Jesus warns his disciples about persecution in Matthew 10. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next, for truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes, warning them of very serious persecution. He even uses this language when he talks about the so-called abomination of desolation in the Mount of Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So elsewhere, when this particular term in the original is used, it suggests the way we flee from something which is otherwise life-threatening, and apparently the herdsmen now felt that perhaps their own lives were threatened by Jesus, and so the text says they begged him to go. They began to beg earnestly not to send them out of the country and for Jesus to depart from their region. So the herdsmen here are frightened, and they flee from Jesus because he scares them. So if you and I are originally curious or unhappy with this passage for what happens to the pigs, the herdsmen are also nervous about what might happen to them. Text is doubly problematic. What happened to gentle Jesus, meek and mild? Pigs dying, herdsmen fleeing? It's not Kenny's Jesus. And then in the denouement, of course, we have in verses 18 through 20, the demoniac. In verse 18, he begged Jesus to let him go along with him. As he, Jesus, was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. Now, reading the narrative at this point, I'm thinking, sure, certainly Jesus will say yes. The demons, crying out through the demon-possessed man, begged him to be permitted to go into the pigs. He said yes to them. Surely he will say yes to this man. Nope. He doesn't do so. Though this person implores him, undoubtedly because Jesus has healed him, he feels comfortable around him, he's happy to be with him. Nope, Jesus won't let him. But he does beg him. Note here, there's 3 different times in the passage that someone begs Jesus to do something, and he decides whether he will grant permission or not. The demoniac begged Jesus not to be sent out of the country. The herdsman begged him to go away, and the now healed demoniac begs him to travel with him. And oddly enough, Jesus permitted the demons not to go out of the country, but into the herd of pigs, but he did not permit the former demoniac to travel with him. What a curious, curious Jesus. We need Alice as our Bible interpreter at this point. Curiouser and curiouser, cried Alice. The text just gets more and more curious. But then notice that the demoniac makes his peace with Jesus' denial of the request, and he goes and did what Jesus said. He went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled. Then, and I believe since then. In this particular event, it seems to me we see an extreme vividness, a portion in the life of Jesus that fulfills the realities from Genesis 3, verses 14 and 15. My humanities students know that we rarely get out of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. We sort of hover there through our discussion of worldviews and our discussion of society and our discussion of ethics. We're always in and around Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And had the Bible stopped at Genesis 3:15, some interesting things would have happened. First of all, Bible memory would have been simpler. But even more so, imagine had it ended at this point where God pledges to put enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Imagine it to people for centuries would have said, I wonder how it's going to actually happen. Some human, born of a woman, is going to have some kind of a remarkable battle with some descendant of this serpent. And the serpent is going to bruise and injure the son of Adam in some ways, and yet the son of Adam, in some ways, will crush the head of the powers of evil. And we would have wondered how it might work out. And Mark says, well, in the life and ministry of Jesus, it happened many times, in many ways. but never more clearly than here. Never a more clear contest between Jesus and the powers of evil and death than here. A clear contest, and also a contest in which the defeat of the powers of evil requires some other creature to be wounded. It is a warfare, and there is collateral damage. Later in the Genesis narrative, we had learned that the seed of the woman would be more specifically the seed of Abraham. And Paul identifies Christ in Galatians 3 as the seed of Abraham, to whom such promises were made. And what we find here is Jesus, in his earthly ministry, is the last Adam who will undo the work of the first Adam. If the first Adam failed to do warfare with the evil one, and therefore permitted his race to become mortal, the last Adam will deliver the children of Adam from sin and from death as its consequences. Christ, in other words, is presented here in a different way than he ordinarily is. He's not merely a teacher, not merely a prophet, not merely a skilled debater confounding the Pharisees with their trapping questions. Here he is a warrior. He is doing warfare. He commits himself to the struggle, determined to deliver those who need to be delivered, and if some collateral damage is the cost of the entire thing, so be it. I don't know exactly who Kenny wanted Jesus to be, but he didn't want him to be this. And maybe Kenny isn't the only one who wants Jesus to be something that he isn't. He is not, after all, our career counselor. We have to figure some of these things out on our own. He is not our boyfriend or our girlfriend. He is not our financial advisor. He's not our marital counselor or our family planner. He is our warrior. He did and does battle with the seed of the serpent, and is in the process, even through gospel preaching today, crushing the head of the seed of the serpent and delivering the children of Adam from its slavery to evil and death. When the demoniac was not permitted to go with Jesus in the boat, he nonetheless did leave the tombs. He no longer lived surrounded by death. He had another shot at life because of his encounter with Christ. So as we wrestle with the consequence of this curious narrative, I think we have to ask the question again, why did Jesus do such a thing? Why did he not simply cast the demons out with the word as he had on other occasions? Why did 2,000 pigs die in order for that particular man to be healed? And what do we learn from this that we might not have learned from the other passages in the Gospels? As is the process of ministers, I might suggest three things. First, the last Adam, Christ, loves the human as God's image more than he loves any other part of God's good and wonderful created order. It is a good and wonderful created order. And many things about it are lovely and testify to God and his grandeur and goodness. But of all of the aspects of that created order, there is not one part